student here in the sociology department. I'm here to introduce Dr. Gaye Johnson. Dr. Gaye Johnson is Associate Professor of Black Studies with affiliations in Chicana Studies and History at the University of California at Santa Barbara. She writes and teaches on race, racism, cultural history, geographies of freedom, and political economy. She is a contributor to the Huffington Post and maintains an engaged presence on the internet as a blogger and a Twitter user. Her first book, Spaces of Conflict, Sounds of Solidarity, Music, Race, and Spatial Entitlements in Los Angeles, is published by the University of California Press, is a history of civil rights and spatial struggles amongst Black and brown freedom seekers and cultural workers in Los Angeles. Johnson's second book, entitled Women in Hip Hop, A Radical Herstory, is under contract with Haymarket Press, a very good progressive imprint that produces a lot of good literature as well. She has contributed journal articles and book chapters to historical, cultural studies, and ethnic studies volumes. Dr. Johnson was also a visiting researcher at Stanford University's Center for Comparative Studies of Race and Ethnicity from 2008 to 2009, where, as a side note, that was where I first encountered Dr. Johnson as well, as a scholar in residence myself. And she's also been a scholar in residence at the African Leadership Academy in Johannesburg, South Africa. She received the 2013 Freedom Now Award for her long-standing efforts with the Los Angeles Community Action Network to increase affordable and safe housing and civil rights on Los Angeles' Skid Row. She's also a member of the board of directors for the Central Coast Alliance United for Sustainable Economy, or CAUSE. Dr. Johnson received her BA in Sociology and Ethnic Studies from the University of California at San Diego and a PhD in American Studies from the University of Minnesota. Please join me in giving a warm welcome for Dr. Gaye Johnson.
Thank you for the nice introduction, and to everybody for having me, and especially to Walter, who answered my 9 million questions about as I sorted out my arrangements to get here today. So, I see now, okay, see what's going on. I think I permanently messed this up. Okay, I'll just make it. So I want to talk about the major themes of spaces of conflict and sounds of solidarity, and then pose some questions and challenges for our work as scholars, writing and thinking together about coalitional politics, and maybe if there's time, I'll share some of the newer things I'm working on. So let me start with, actually, I want to read from the first chapter of my book, just as an introduction. Charlotta Bass was ecstatic. As editor of the most enduring Black newspaper in Los Angeles, she had been invited to attend the 1947 Women's Asiatic Conference in Peking. It never dawned on me, she wrote, that I would ever have the opportunity even to consider a visit to that part of the world. The invitation reflected the international attention she had garnered after nearly 3 decades of social justice work among the multiracial working class in Los Angeles. From the time she began editing the California Eagle in 1912, Bass's writings and activism transformed the political import of Black Los Angeles to both local communities of color and international organizations. Well known for her public campaigns against racially restrictive covenants in housing and persistent efforts on behalf of Black community development and empowerment, Bass also championed the rights and dignity of Mexican Americans. She served as a member of the sponsoring commission for the Sleepy Lagoon Defense Committee, organized on behalf of a group of young Mexican Americans that were falsely accused of murder, and she campaigned forcefully against the racial brutalities exacted upon Mexican American zoot suitors during the summer of 1943. Congress of Industrial Organizations activist Alice McGrath recalled that even before the Spanish language newspaper La Opinión took up the cause, the California Eagle was, quote, one of the first papers to recognize and publicize the racist and discriminatory nature of that case. When Bass arrived at the airport for her trip to China, she was detained. In an organized effort, officials delayed the processing of her paperwork for so long that she missed her flight. She recalled, "After a night's wrestle with sleep, I awoke the next morning with a renewed determination to make the California Eagle a bigger and better newspaper And as I settled down to the production of the next issue, I whispered to it, I can't go to China, but you can, and you will tell the people how disappointed I was. Spaces of conflict, sounds of solidarity is an echo. It's kind of like a re-articulation in some respects of Bass's pronouncement. I wrote about Black and Chicano struggles in LA because it's a history I know something about as a scholar and as a person, but also because these two groups share the decided dishonor of being the most historically aggrieved groups in LA, the most negatively depicted, and collectively the most visibly utilized in the subjugation of one another. And early on, as I surveyed the historiography, both scholarly and popular, about Black and brown LA, I was reminded of an old saying popular among Black church congregations, that a lie can travel halfway around the world before the truth is even put on its shoes. Contemporary conservative news sources have been a relentless source of characterizations that depict the relationship between Black and Latino communities as little more than eternally tense, inherently competitive, and sometimes mutually violent. And at times, this has been the only audible discourse in discussions about the futures of these communities, and it has been more lie than truth. Certainly, there are devastating examples of intergroup tensions contained in the record of Black-brown interactions. History has shown that this record of interracial coalitional politics can be as demoralizing as it is powerful. The social problems and internal tensions that plague us in separate struggles can feel and be more complex when we form movements and share dreams with other collectives. Yet there are far more examples of mutually meaningful Black-brown anti-racist struggles and radical creative affiliations. And if we wish to envision and enact a future in which mutual and separate struggles will come to just fruition, we have to rewrite the story we've been told about who we are and about our value to one another. So for this book, I chose 5 historical moments from 1940 to the present to examine 3 major themes: the political economy of Black-brown oppression in LA in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the interracial anti-racist activism deployed against those forces, and the deployment of spatial and sonic politics as a critical tool to seek full cultural enfranchisement, social membership, and political agency. So again, how this last theme was the deployment of spatial and sonic politics as a critical tool to seek full cultural enfranchisement, social membership, and political agency. And so this last theme became a theory I developed that I call spatial entitlement, which is the mechanisms by which excluded communities have created new collectivities that are more than just translocal solidarities, that are constituted by dispersal or estrangement or marginalization based not just upon eviction and exclusion from physical places, but also on new and creative uses of technology and spaces. And this meant the transformation of the ways that people move themselves through space, which spaces they congregated in, and what entitlements are asserted with the cultural currency they created. So for example, struggles for residential, educational, and occupational equality. And so my thought is that articulating spatial entitlements does more than just claim particular discursive and physical spaces. It enables disaffected groups to reveal the history and effects of long-term racial and economic discrimination on their communities, articulating a right to visibility and mobility in physical places, and demanding recognition and respect in discursive spaces addresses and redresses the injuries that are enacted by systemic spatial isolation and racism. Public demands for dignity and respect by people that are meant to be contained or invisible, such as low-income communities or undocumented immigrants, constitute more than a demand for specific concessions and reforms. They also identify and contest spatial structures of racial exclusion. They create an alternative narrative to official histories of cities, spaces, and places by exposing and opposing the mechanisms of race and gendered containment. They project new visions of justice and democracy, and these new visions take up space, both figuratively and literally. So by inflecting familiar places and spaces with new meanings, these visions tap into popular memories of particular places to reconfigure them as geographies of democracy. So I argue that the generation of new understandings of place and space constitute an archive of community information that is encoded in popular expression. So let me give you an example. For example, in '57, when 5 freeways were built through Boyle Heights. This is, of course, a phenomenon that occurs often with low-income communities, where the city officials will come in and through eminent domain declare an area fit for kind of gentrification or redirection in terms of the vision that city officials have for that space and for the city. And so 5 freeways are built through one neighborhood. And so what happens to that neighborhood? And this is why I think Casey's discussion of space is important, because when we look at these maps, they're very important for us when we're doing cultural studies, we have to also be very clear about the geography that we're talking about. And it was actually kind of confounding for me as I examined, especially the work of Philip Ethington at USC, who talks about how actually the spaces after World War II for both Blacks and Latinos actually expand in some ways, the available spaces. So I was thinking about how to juxtapose, like how does this work out? I mean, I'm thinking about all the ways that Black and brown people are confined in this period of time, but at the same time I'm looking at these maps and I'm thinking, well, wait a minute, the space is increasing. But then this brings me to this question of meaningful space, because what does it matter how much space you have if that space doesn't mean anything to you, right? If all the space that you have encountered in your life and in the generations before you, and all of the plans you have for the generations after you are about the particular spaces you've inhabited, about the streets, about the sounds, about the stores, about the barber shops, about the taquerias and the panaderias, about all of these places that make community. Once those are eradicated, you can't just replace those with another kind of space. So this is why I wrote about Chavez Ravine, because Chavez Ravine was such an important locus of community for I hope people have heard of Chavez Ravine and the way in which the city came through and designated it through eminent domain as a place that would be demolished and then used to create low-income housing units. Eventually, that's not what happened. They give it to Walter O'Malley, who brings the Dodgers to LA, and now what we have is Dodger Stadium on top of Chavez Ravine. But again, here's the point, is that Ethington shows that there's an expansion of space, actually, for Latinos for Mexicans, especially Mexican Americans in this period of time. But again, here I was asking myself, what does that mean? And so when people then are faced with this, and particularly in the case of Chavez Ravine, because some of these people own these homes, and so they're evicted from them. Some of them actually carried out of their homes while the bulldozers waited next to their homes to destroy them. Many of them didn't. It took them 3 to 6 generations, some of them, not all of them even, to recover the assets that they had originally had in these homes. But also, many of these places, even just in terms of how they're geographically and spatially depicted in the official history of Los Angeles, were erased from maps as if they had never existed, as if nobody had ever lived there. So again, this question of meaningful space. So I have in this book written a narrative of history of Black and Chicano coalitional politics to counteract the dominant narrative of dissent that dominates popular understandings of our relationships to one another. But today I'm compelled, considering the work that we've kind of mapped out for one another, I hope, to talk about the challenges of writing coalitional politics in history. So let me give you an example. I'm actually have a cold, sorry. So I'm a little verklempt, but not for reason right now. So let me give you an example. Okay, so I wrote about housing and labor struggles and youth counterculture in the 1940s, and in the 1950s I talked about the evisceration of black and brown neighborhoods, Chavez Ravine, one of them Boyle Heights, one of them in 57 with these 5 freeways that I talked to you about the and these are just some examples from the book. This one is Dolphins of Hollywood, a record store that was opened by John Dolphin, who discerned that you couldn't buy black records in Hollywood, so he thought he would bring Hollywood to blacks in South LA. So he opened this record store on Central and Vernon, and he hired white DJs to broadcast on the radio from the picture window in the front. And this is how Huggy Boy, this is how so many other, Hunter Hancock ended up becoming famous. But also then we have the proliferation of some interracial music groups too that express some of the material realities of black and brown interaction, and also some of the difficulties that they face. And the Jaguars are a very interesting example because they're from Fremont High. Their experience is that of kind of the quintessential South LA experience. They go to a multiracial high school where there is quite a bit of racism, but they enjoyed an incredible amount of local success. You see them here with Hunter Hancock on his show Harlem Matinee. But one of the problems that they had was that they couldn't break into the national market, and the reason was because people didn't know how to market them. They had no idea what they said, well, we show up, and he said, like, for example, the guy I interviewed, Gal Polyuta, said, Dick Clark asked us, like, who are you? Like, what, you look so different from how you sound. They thought we were black, and then, they show up and they're this multiracial group and they don't know what to do with them. So this is just an example of but, as I'm saying, I'm writing about in the 1950s the evisceration of these neighborhoods and also then the sonic and the spatial entitlements that are asserted in protest against them. And one of the spatial and sort of combined sonic spatial entitlements has to do with the way that Whittier Boulevard is transformed into a space that's claimed, especially by Latino cruisers, because this is a place that, after these 5 freeways are built, is not meant to be for this kind of environment, for this kind of practice, but nonetheless it transforms into this. Why? Because one of the ways that people thought that they would keep the riffraff away from the new businesses that are actually sanctioned for that area is to put gigantic floodlights on the streets to keep people away from the businesses, and it's perfect for cruising. But also this is important, what's important here also is like a historical development, two historical developments really very much related, and that is the evolution of the car radio at this time. And so what that means for what you can play and how other people can hear it. So again, there's sort of sonic entitlement, right, to announce who you are on the landscape, and then also the transforming or the transference of the kind of skills that are acquired when you are working at Boeing, for example. And so all of these World War II jobs that recruited a lot of black and brown people to work in these, but they learn these skills, painting and all kinds of things. And then this creates also a kind of fluency and in terms of working on cars. And so this becomes an incredible pastime as well, because then also cars become more affordable too. So Latino families can own particular kinds of car. And then the advertisement from that period of time also suggests that Chevy and Ford were starting to market towards these groups of people. But I mean, the important thing I want to mention, like right off the bat, is that I don't in any way suggest that this makes up for the kind of asset loss that occurs in places like Chavez Ravine or in Boyle Heights. But what I'm saying is that a lot of times aggrieved groups have no other way to make a pronouncement. I mean, many sort of white entitled people have their homes, have their wealth to put them on a map in terms of sort of generational legacy, etc. But often the only kind of entitlement, the only kind of sort of social citizenship that aggrieved groups can claim and articulate is through popular culture. And so this was one way of saying, I'm here. You know, every Friday night, even though my house, my grandmother's house, the panaderia that used to be here, all of this stuff that was my meaningful space is no longer here. I'm gonna be here every Friday night. And you're gonna hear me, and you're gonna see that chandelier in the front seat of my car. And so, you know, I mean, this is important for us to understand in terms of its possibilities, but also its limits. Because I think, just as an aside here, one of the victories of the multicultural scholarship that occurred, you know, and continues to, especially you know, starting in the 90s, was that it made culture everything, and it gets us away from talking about these material realities. So anyway, then I talk about, in the 1960s, I talk about the coalitions between third world internationalist movements, and also how that matches up with California's very carefully constructed narrative about ethnic pluralism at that time, and also the sonic manipulations of bands like Senor Soul. This is precursors of war, and the Midnighters that belie this narrative. And then, you know, I also, of course, here we have this incredible record of Black and brown interaction, but also a real kind of fluency in the mutual affiliations and relevance of these struggles that was not just about Latinos and Blacks, but also about Asian Americans as well. So this is the example I wanted to give you, is that, you know, then I get to the 70s and the 80s, and I hit this strange wall, because all the coalitional politics that are relatively visible in these past moments are all of a sudden gone. So this happens for two interrelated reasons. This is a horrible time for poor people, a horrible time. And the cultural expressions of resistance are necessarily obscured, but also suppressed by a more dominating narrative about what constitutes certain kinds of cultural expression. And in this instance, I'm talking about punk music. So I'm going to talk about punk a little bit to perhaps challenge us as scholars that are trying to think about this work of Afro Latinidad, not just as an identity politics, but also in terms of coalitional endeavors and as a model, like as a strategic, ontological, epistemological kind of model for the kind of social justice work that I think is important, not just in the community, but in the academy as well. So in other words, how do we work around the challenges of coalition? Here I come to this moment, and I think, well, here's the record all the way up now to now of all of these incredible coalitions. Even if they're nothing that we've ever been taught, it's not that hard to uncover them. But now I get to this point, especially in the 1980s under Reaganomics and Thatcherism, where I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I don't see anything. And it reminded me of this period of time that I always teach about in this survey I teach in the history department, where, you know, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. I mean, this is such an incredible group, in part because they don't win anything forever. It takes forever for them to win anything, but they persist. And this was a sort of scholarly inspiration for me, but it also reminded me that there are all of these terrible failures that happen that often are sort of rehearsal for future successes. And that many of us don't know anything about that kind of protracted struggle these days, mostly because many of us grew up in the generation that's defined by the conservative backlash against civil rights, and not by civil rights itself. So again, how do we work around the challenges of coalition when you come to a point where there really aren't any visible, right, or where there are lots of failures? What does Afro Latinidad offer us in the lean times? In the moments when coalitions are hard to discern, but the contours of historical struggle still offer a prescription for social justice? Is there a strategy or a theory we can cull from these most difficult moments? Scholars who study the coalitional politics and interracial spaces of leisure in this era know that there are far more social forces tearing people apart than there were pulling them together. So particularly for Black and brown urban communities like in Los Angeles, the effects of supply-side economics were socially and personally devastating and rarely led to sustained cooperation with other groups, mostly because people were doing their best to sustain their own families and immediate communities through this storm. So first, like, what's the historical moment? Reaganomics is the most serious attempt to change the course of US economic policy since the New Deal. Reagan takes office in 1981, and his solution to the worst economic downturn since the Depression was to propose that the supply side of the economy be stimulated through tax cuts for the wealthy, providing an opportunity for the upper class to acquire and presumably invest more money. So economic terms like supply side and trickle down suggested that reducing taxes for the wealthy would free individuals and businesses to expand their operations domestically and internationally, thereby maximizing economic gain for all social classes. The central theme of Reaganomics, therefore, is that a reduction in taxes for the wealthy would provide greater investment opportunities to the upper class, eventually leading to the creation of more jobs for the working class. Instead, we know what happens is that the US accrues more debt during the Reagan administration than in any other era. And when Reagan takes office in '81, the national debt is about $1 trillion, which is a figure that includes all accrued debt from the Revolutionary, Spanish-American, Civil, Korean, Vietnam, and both world wars. But while it took the US more than 200 years to accumulate that debt, that balance, by the time Reagan leaves office, it had increased by $2.5 trillion. So the redistribution and expansion of wealth during this time period set the stage for the decline of living standards for the poorest Americans, while incomes of the wealthiest citizens soared. On the whole, in LA, blacks and Chicanos and Latinos were most affected by these changes. Not quite 2 decades after minorities gained legitimate entree into LA's best-paying blue-collar jobs, devastating plant closures hit the city. By 1988, not one of the auto, rubber, or steel plants is left standing. I never thought that I'd be writing about punk music, but here I was. Why? Because I'm writing about LA in the 1980s without, and you can't do that without talking about black and Chicano, especially Chicano punk. But there's something else I found, because I'm reading kind of like really the Bible of introduction to punk, which is Dick Hebditch's Subculture and the Meaning of Style. He's at UCSB as well. And I found this common argument in this historiography at this time. So in his cultural history of British punk, he argues that through style, through the subversion of common objects, this allowed punk youth to separate themselves symbolically from their cultural context, right? Challenging tradition, denying the local and mass cultures from which they emerge. And he says, look, punk refused to be grounded, to be read back to its origins, because punk style makes this break, not only with the parent culture, but also with its own location and experience. So as a result, he's talking about white punks. Well, yes, he's not totally explicit all the time, but he is talking about white punks. Otherwise, powerless youth transform themselves into a subculture with much more significance. But as I look at blacks and Chicanos in LA, I see a completely different story. And also in other parts, especially like Chicago, where I came into, I started to look at some of the punk groups there. And so, in fact, one of the most influential punk groups, and the lead, Martin Sarondegui, he explained that for us, he said, singing punk doesn't mean letting go of the ties that we have to our parents, to our families, or where we're from, or to our language. It doesn't mean breaking away from that. It means working with them to try to get somewhere, to get to a new level. And so when I thought about what he had to say, especially in this incredible film I recommend called Más Allá de los Gritos, which is Beyond the Screams, I also encountered this as I was kind of wrapping up the book. I was reading Alice Bagg's brand new autobiography that had just come out, and she talks about how she accompanied her parents to the Spanish language movies in LA on Dos por Uno nights at the $1 Million Theater on Broadway in downtown LA. And she said, look, at that time, Broadway is still the vibrant commercial center of downtown LA and an important part of Latino life in the city. And she says, look, as soon as the theater lights went down, we were transported to an impossibly glamorous black and white version of Mexico. And she talked about seeing actors like Pedro Infante, Jorge Negrete, Libertad Lamarque, Pedro Armendáriz, and Sylvia Pinal. To her, she said this was like escapism at its finest. And so she finds another mode of escape through the songs and performance style of Spanish pop singers and movie star Rafael Sanchez. She said he made this lasting impression on me with this dramatic, passionate singing style. But Pedro Infante could wrap me around his finger with his romantic songs, bring out the feisty side of me when he was telling off someone, or yank a tear from my eye if he was doing a sad song. So this woman, who was at that time Alicia Armendariz, becomes Alice Bag, who was first a member of the punk band Mask Era, then the visionary leader of the Bags. And one of the things that she says is that she said, look, I always practice using my own methods. I danced, I posed, I made faces at myself. And she said in this respect, she was more like these actors that she had seen than any of her rock idols like Elton John or The Clash. So anyway, the reason that I mentioned this is because it's important for us to understand how spatial politics then work, especially with black and brown people who are aggrieved in this particular way under Reaganomics at this time. And that is because there becomes this issue of spatial immobilization that I then talk about in this period of time. So whereas before, we're talking about expansion of space and the way that people use space in meaningful ways. Now we're coming to a point, especially in the 80s, of war on drugs, and in the 90s, and the rise of the prison industrial complex, and it becomes a situation where black and brown people are literally immobilized in some of these areas. And we see this in sharp relief when we see in '92 the uprising in South LA, where people kept questioning, why is it that black people destroyed their own neighborhood? Well, part of the reason is because there were barricades that the police put up. They couldn't get out, right? But it's also about the spatial allocation and reallocation of space, the way that freeways block people off, the way that streets narrow and really don't provide any kind of way out. And so there's this, I started thinking about how this happens globally and started to make some connections to other parts of the world, as you can see. But the point here is that I started to rethink this idea of how people use space, because I thought about what does it mean to not necessarily seek out more space, but to rework the space you have, because you really don't have any options to transcend it or go beyond it in any kind of sustained way. So what was then the power of staying that Sorondegi is talking about, that Alice Bag is talking about, the power of staying in that space and creating it. So when Sorondegi says, look, it's not about breaking with the parent culture, as Heptich suggests, it's actually about making something out of the cultural experience that I have, about valuing it. Even as there was quite a bit of talk back to it. So as working class subcultures, I think about how Bag's entrenchment in Mexican and Mexican-American popular cultural traditions, Sorondegi's characterization of a punk identity rooted in family, place, and language require this radical rethinking of the meaning of punk politics and their relationship to race and to place. And so in that sense, then these productions divulge much more than the terrible costs of economic downsizing and deindustrialization for communities of color. They reveal social identities that are forged from the collective witness and the shared experience of racial and class inequality. They create a new framework of interracial and transnational affiliations rooted in local experiences. And I think this is the most important thing, rooted in local experiences of racism, of struggle, of displacement. So in the 70s and 80s in LA, and 90s to some extent too, black and brown anti-racist politics are fashioned from this unique sense of self that includes collective memories of displacement, surely, because we're not that far removed generationally from these experiences, and then also the confinement of that particular generation. Because of urban renewal, because of exile, because of labor, migration, and memories of struggle in race-based mobilization for rights, for resources, for recognition, for peace. And this shared sense of self is connected to the people and the places that surround these social actors. I have a picture here of Limp Wrist, which is a later iteration of Sorondegi's band. And I love the "Don't Knock It Till You Try It" quip there. But I'm not going to talk about this now, but the other thing, surprising thing that this chapter had me do is to think about how queer identity, queer politics also inform black and brown sensibility at this time. And also how, when we kind of imbricate all of those things together, again, it creates this tapestry, this prescription for a radical kind of politics that is really much more than about what your kind of cultural affiliations are with sexuality or with punk music or whatever, but it's really about these radical politics that are advanced and generated by these new cultural productions that necessarily include all of these elements. So critiques about racial, economic, environmental justice connected the grassroots and coalitional politics of Black and brown struggle to punk discourse in this period of time. And the movements I'm talking about, especially the environmental justice movements, the Mothers of East Los Angeles at this time, all of these incredible movements to try to end incinerators being built in East LA. Punk is really not the soundtrack of these movements, to be honest with you. But the thing that becomes clear is that as they coexist, this punk movement, especially in Chicano culture, and then also these coalitional politics that, as I said, are really kind of a collection of failures, a few wins, a few critical wins at this time, but a difficult period to examine. They share, however, this punk subculture and these movements. They share this weariness with racial injustices that are faced by their communities, and the articulated entitlements of Black and brown punks for recognition, human dignity, and spatial justice is because you talk about a sonic spatial entitlement. You can't ignore the volume or the method of the deployment of these sonic entitlements, especially in punk. And this is both within and outside immediate communities where goals that are shared with movements for social justice. So this history of radical interracial politics persists, even during this economic and infrastructural downturn. So organizations like the Coalition for Women's Economic Development, the Esperanza Community Housing Corporation, they seek to forge the dozens of separate neighborhood organizations into a broader movement for community development. The Jobs with Peace campaign sponsored a successful citywide referendum in '84 that calls for the federal government to cut the Pentagon budget to place the savings into job-creating community economic development programs. Black and Chicano neighborhood associations witnessed the results of the collapse of government social welfare, spending in the decline of community social services, but they also win important gains through steady activism. And one of the more notable examples is the struggle against Lancer, the Los Angeles City Energy Recovery Plant incinerator project. The efforts to organize across race and space in this period flow from the understanding that environmental and labor-related injuries to one community are indicative of a pointed disregard for particular communities of marginalized groups. They're more than coalitions that are based on shared experiences of marginalization, because these social actors articulate human and social entitlements based on a mutual understanding of the value of their communities, in spite of the spatial, the social, the environmental disregard that city planners show for these communities. These efforts reflect a profound belief in the value of Black and brown lives, and they create an alternative means to social justice as a shared practice between these movements and particular subcultures. I won't talk about this here either, but I do talk about swap meets as one of these spaces. But this was like kind of an ethnographer's dream. I contacted the Mothers of East Los Angeles and asked, do you have any old pictures? Because I wrote about you guys, I want to include them. And they, yeah, no, I don't. And then somebody called me back like a month later and said, oh wait, we found this old computer, we hadn't turned it on like 6 years, and then there's all these incredible pictures, right? Really amazing, amazing pictures of these coalitional politics that are happening at this time. And really then, of course, led to a whole other set of ethnographic questions. But anyway, I will wrap it up right now. And I'll do that by saying that this deep and persistent poverty abides in many of the communities that Black and brown people call home, especially in South LA today. The combination of wage inequality, stagnant economic growth, public disinvestment in urban communities, and labor discrimination has created these staggering disparities over the last 20 years for these groups. So in many ways, things have gotten much worse, much, much worse. And at this moment, all of these things like the anti-immigration policies, economic restructuring, prison industrial complex have come together in what I call teeth-gritting harmony to severely curtail the freedom and mobility of Black and brown people. And politicians, corporate executives, moral pundits have displayed such palpable and prolific indifference to human rights on issues of immigration and racial suppression that it can often seem like no one else is speaking. But I think if we study, I think in the way that we're trying to generate here, unlikely sources of articulation to reveal dissent in spatial planes, sonic articulation, and we think about struggle and its expression as central to conscious Black and brown performance in politics, then we come to understand that it's possible to view the deep contradictions and the complexities of Black and brown cultural productions and interracial struggle as par for the course when our dreams go into action. So really, I think the record here does more than just tell the people how disappointed we are, because multiple spatial and psychic assaults on communities of color have prompted some people to surrender to individualistic strategies about how we move forward. And in these instances, the attitude is much more defeatist, renouncing the networks of shared struggle and collective good that have not always been successful, but that have sustained communities through their most challenging moments. So one might hear from these individuals, look, all we have is ourselves. We have to work with each other only until we get our own house in order, and then we'll work with other people. But if we look at this record, the lessons contained in the historiography of Black, brown, spatial struggles and cultural expression, the efforts of individuals and social justice groups on behalf of human dignity and a desire to maintain, offer unity, offer a different message, and we're willing to listen. They say we have each other. Thank you.
I'm here to introduce our next speaker, which is Mark Sawyer, who is currently a professor of African American Studies and Political Science at UCLA, and the director of the Center of Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Politics. In the fall of 2005, he was a visiting associate professor at the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. He received his PhD in political science from the University of Chicago in December of 1999. Dr. Sawyer's talk today will be about his book, Just Neighbors, which challenges the traditional black-white paradigm of American race relations by examining African Americans and Latinos as they relate to each other in the labor market, the public sphere, neighborhoods, and schools. Sawyer explores the possibilities for social and political cooperation between the two groups in Los Angeles and finds that lingering stereotypes among both groups, as well as negative attitudes among African Americans about immigration, remain powerful but potentially surmountable forces in group relations. Dr. Sawyer's work lays a much-needed foundation for studying social relations between minority groups and shows that Latinos and African Americans have a profound potential for coalition building and mutual cooperation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mark Sawyer.
Thank you for that generous introduction. Also, thank you to Samy, Gary, and Walter for bringing me here. Like, it's been a while since I've been here, but people don't really know. It kind of doesn't show up in my CV that I have a kind of shadow Stanford life that has gone, career that's gone on parallel and everything else like that. So I actually finished my coursework here. I wrote my dissertation from the Bay Area. And then I returned as a Richard Fellow when we saw, and then, I don't know, I've been here 100 times. My brother-in-law got married here. I think this is all, there's a shadow Stanford life that I've had. I'm also sorry I was late. My wife, just before I went to the airport to take and was going to take the rental car back, said, make sure you take the kid's car seat out of it. And I think I could do better dismantling a nuclear device before I had to get on an airplane than taking a kid's car seat out of the car. There's no comparison. So, and I also really appreciate being on, Gaye Johnson's a scholar that I've observed from a distance, but have now gotten to really experience. And I'm gonna tell 2 quick stories. It's just amazing how much what she was discussing is parallel just the week that I had. I was mostly a babysitter with my kid this week because my wife was out of town. And school was, we pay a lot of money for UCLA lab schools. They have all these people 3 days. I don't know what that's about. They should only go from 9 to 11, so I'm gonna, so we decided to do a Wonder Woman marathon. We got all the seasons. We're gonna sit there and watch Wonder Woman. And there's this point where, like, I realized that television in the 70s had a lot more people of color on it than the 80s. Right, so there's one scene, and you know, for a kid that grew up during this period, to see Linda Carter opposite Jane Kennedy, I was just leaving it at that. it was very good. And so there's that point we got to realize things don't, there's the long march to freedom, right? Things don't inevitably progress, nor do they inevitably get worse. We're agents, and we have to be agents to change. As we interact with them, we have to sort of think and calibrate. The other experience I had is, I was in Kidland all week this week, which I enjoyed. And so I didn't realize this freak show, this rancher guy had gone on. So I'm bored. We just boarded Southwest plane, and they closed the doors, and there's one woman who seems terribly inebriated sitting next to an older white guy, who's describing his support for this guy's beliefs. And you know, it's sort of basically making an argument. He's like 3 rows ahead of me, and he's talking very loud. And she's saying, you know, yeah, and she's so sick of this dumb Obama, and she's gonna stay here just for a little while longer, but he's gonna ruin the country by the time. And then he says, you know what, they were better off slaves. And at that point, there's a black flight attendant, a brother who's not slight. And he turns to the guy and he goes, look, I will have them turn this plane around and put you off of here if you say anything like that again. And the guy, like, there was this moment where, like, you could see that, like, because the guy's like probably like late 60s, 70s. But it was interesting perceptible because I was telling someone the story and they were like, wow, he must be so upset. I was like, no, because there was this moment where, like, his sense of his own white privilege just went crashing down. Right? Like he just, the brother got in his face and said that, and he could not do one thing about it. He had to sit there and shut up the whole rest of the flight and stew in his own juice. And that's just to say that, like, very kind of retrograde thinking, but also the power of white supremacy is still very much with us. And that's going to be kind of a background to talk. So I don't want to spend a lot of time. I did a survey in 2007. I'm a political scientist. We do surveys sometimes. I also write about music sometimes. And I do want to engage Gaye about the Chicago house scene in games. And in particular, also the gender issues with that, as well as its involvement of Latinos and Filipinos with African Americans. So I write about music sometimes too. So we surveyed a good cross-section of Los Angeles. 53% of the interviews were conducted in Spanish. 88% of the Asians that took it chose to take it in an Asian language. And one of the things that survey research is it's very expensive to do this, but you really get different data if you don't spend the money on it. I'm not going to go on question modules. So there's a series of theories of Black and Latino interactions, right? So one is the conflict school. And I actually think that that's the people who are pushing Latino assimilation ideas are really also simultaneously push an idea that conflict between African Americans and Latinos is inevitable. As Latinos assimilate, they're going to have to continually distance themselves, but it should. And then there's also this kind of celebratory idea that Latinos are introducing this new way of thinking about race. Because, obviously mixed race people never existed before. So Latinos have shown up and they think of themselves as mixed race. And so now the world is ready for a raceless society in which Latinos usher in this new reality, right? And that's also part of their assimilation, right? So, Ricky Martin will be our music, we will eat salsa, we will do this. But largely white supremacy will remain untouched, and Black people will still be at the bottom, and we're passe at this point, right? There's another way to think about it too, it's called the race war school. So this is the people focus on the kind of gang violence, the occasional outbreaks of gang violence, prison violence. People don't really know that the prison violence is mostly orchestrated by the guards. It isn't inevitable. And also people who are in interracial gangs on the street end up in race gangs in prison, right? So that's a whole part of it. So there's a big difference. So that's another part. Here's actually one of the more insidious ones, which is there's a version of, mostly local leaders, because at the national level people are much more sophisticated. There's a version of sort of traditional Black civil rights leadership that just sees Latino advancement is just not in the interest of Black folks. You know, there's only so much resources we have here. We need to make, I'd like throw like Earl Lafayette Hutchinson and people like that. I don't know. He's a soft version of it, but it's a soft, very problematic take. So then there's the folks who can also be a little too celebratory, and they sort of think, there's sort of this inevitable minority coalition. And there's also kind of school that says, well, look, there's certain things we can get along about. We can get along about labor and issues like education, labor rights. So they see a lot of work around unions and things like that. And that's actually, I'll show you that the data supports that that's kind of more realistic. But I do want to think about the conflict school a little bit more. So how to explain, the conflict school doesn't explain the uneven sets of interactions, right? I mean, all the way from what Gaye explained to the musical groups, the people on the street, and you can have people who are in coalition and in conflict in very different situations, right? And then you can also have, it also has a kind of flat take on identity, right? So the fluidity of identity is not possible in some ways. And some of the conflict people, I actually encountered one day. I was walking with my child, who was a Latino woman, and asked, she said, "Oh, you're pretty daughter, blah, 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 she's Black." And I was like, "Yes, she's Black." And then I turned away and I spoke to her, and I spoke to my child in Spanish. She spoke back in Spanish, she goes to school in Spanish. And when we said, "Why are you speaking Spanish to her? She's Black." And I was like, where do I start here? And I was like, I didn't want to have her, some people but I told her, like, my daughter can't imagine a world in which there's not Black people who speak Spanish, and she's 5. So you've constructed a set of categories that are separate, that don't exist in her mind, right? She couldn't make sense of, she asked me, well, why did she say that? Like, she couldn't make sense of that. Obviously I speak Spanish. And then she told the lady she speaks French too, but she's not quite as good as French. So this situational engagement with race, and I really want to think about how, if I'll be my most pessimistic, so please don't get mad at me. I'm doing that on purpose. So if I make it the hardest case, and we can still get some daylight, then it's good. I believe that Latinos and African Americans have a case of prejudice without racism. And they're situational parts of interaction. Let me go to this slide. This is the most important. So, we have to make a few assumptions about white-Black relations that tell us that can't tell us anything about Blacks and Latinos. Right, so the idea, Gary knows this, right? You can ask, 5 questions to a white person, and you probably know what they think about everything. Most things. It's very predictive. That doesn't work. I'm expecting to be here. That doesn't work with Blacks and Latinos. So if you get them to express prejudice about even the group that's the target of the next policy, it doesn't predict their attitude about the policy that's targeted at the group. Right? So that means that there's a lot of noise. So this actually tells us something about white supremacy. White supremacy is a unique ideology that while it has impact on everyone, it is only coherent in the mind of some whites. It organizes their worldview in a way that is extraordinarily powerful, right? And so this tells us a lot about the ideology, right? So I don't have to say Black people. in an academic route. All I have to do is say welfare. I don't even have to show black people in the ad. And his person said, we're trying to keep racial resentment. See, the coherence of that ideology, of the signs and symbols and the way it lines up so powerfully, doesn't exist for everyone else. They have other ideologies, but not that relationship with white supremacy, where it organizes their worldview in such powerful ways, the signs and symbols of it. So there's more noise in the interaction between blacks and browns than the signal. The signals we do get are mostly positive, but most studies assume the white-black model, and they make huge negative leaps. And so I'll give you an example about this. I've gotten into with Paula McLean about this. So Paula asked black folks in Durham or wherever it's in North Carolina, she makes up the names. If there are more Latinos, will black people have less political power? They say yes. Paula says that's conflict. White folks are angry. No, they're not. That's fair. Right? You can't assume the second belief, right? That there's a resentment associated with it. That's just assumed in her work, right? So she assumes white racial resentment organizes the way in which black people are thinking about that. St. Paul Schneiderman. I forgot it. This was Stanford.
Don't worry, I can almost promise you he's not here.
So in his book about why black people are racist, he asked black people, if there are more Latino immigrants that come to your community, will you have to spend more money on schools? And the black people say yes. So it is only the white supremacists. So I'm like, what's wrong with this story, right? It came to me, right? It's that this white supremacist logic that the world is upside down. That if these people come to your neighborhood, you don't want to spend money, you don't want to educate them. It's just, he doesn't even actually write that logic. It's just assumed as the way things work, rather than the ways in which progressive people have concluded that if we have more kids in the neighborhood, we might want to spend more on education. What a crazy thought. And that saying it to him marks you as a racist, because he automatically assumes that in your mind, if you make that connection, then you're making a racist logical leap. And so that's what I'm trying to say, how the work uses that model as assumption, and it makes huge leaps from a couple of questions of the survey, and I've come back and looked at it and said, well, you can't say that from this. And in fact, when you do the other work, there aren't the correlations that they suggest. I'll skip over it. People have seen the Costas paintings in Mexico and Penguin and all that stuff. One of the things I did in LA was I asked the Latino race question a little different. So this is both an English question. I want to ask you about some other ways that Latino Americans describe themselves racially. Are you Indio, Moreno, Mestizo, Negro, Blanco, Mulatto, Trigueño, or would you use none of these to describe yourself? So let's see how this works. There we go. So those categories were mostly selected by foreign born. And I was surprised to find out the most common category was Moreno. So Latinos in LA are describing themselves using a category that associates oneself with blackness, darkness, or perhaps negritude. Are Mexican Americans more like African Americans or Italians or Irish Americans? You're not seeing this slide correctly, so let me see if I can tease it out. So, blacks say Latinos are like us. Latinos say they're other. And then whites in LA stereotype them, but offer them the opportunity to be an ethnicity. That's a very complex tapestry, right? What's the most important problem facing, problem definition, what's the problem facing America, facing Los Angeles, facing your race and ethnic group? So, most important problem. This is the nation, and this is for Latinos, and it was similar for blacks as well. So you had like 28.3 at the time the war in Iraq. Most important problem facing Los Angeles for Latinos, it was immigration, crime, traffic. Most important problem facing African Americans. When African Americans talk about their group, unemployment, education, and race relations were the top three. For Latinos, immigration, education, and racial discrimination. Jobs was the secondary one. I'm sure that's gone up since 2007. So we can see substantial overlaps here about how the groups are thinking about themselves, though this is some other stuff that we got. I think some stuff I just do because I like to have fun about stuff. So I just want to show you here that I'll leave this slide alone because it's a good chuckle. If you look at the orange, you will see the orange and the light beige, light yellow sort of. You will see that Hugo Chavez is more popular with African Americans in 2007 than George Bush is. And Black Angelinos. By like doubles the number. See, I'm it just goes to show you the association, right? The association with the Latin American leader, the power of that in the context of African Americans. People wouldn't even assume that they would know who that is. So intergroup attitudes, and there are a lot of what we can expect. These are like welfare stereotypes. They're high when you ask blacks, Asians, Latinos about welfare, not wanting to work hard, crime involved with gangs and drugs. So the groups both stereotype themselves and others. The only stereotype that works for Asians is language fluency. So everybody but Asians perceive that Asians can't speak English well. Even Latinos. Here's the gangs and drugs. So you see, there is stereotyping. Now, if we look at slavery and discrimination affect black success, Latinos are more willing, blacks are most willing to believe that. Whites and Asians the least, and Latinos are in the middle. Do illegal immigrants hurt or help the economy? Oh, one thing is, so from left to right, it's blacks, Asians, Latinos, and the oranges help. So Latinos really think that they help. Blacks are less happy about that. Actually, one of the things that's crazy about the survey is we vary the use of illegal immigrant versus undocumented. And so half the sample got illegal immigrant, half the sample got undocumented. Undocumented hold less well. There's something about the sort of PC nature of a term that rubs people the wrong way. People are willing to say, look, we'll help illegal immigration, but they want you to call it what they think it is. I know it upsets people, it's dehumanizing, but this is one of those times when you come across a finding as a social science researcher and it is what it is. This was support for immigration policy alternatives. Oh, and it had effect, the language had a negative effect on support for policy. So I'll get through this real quick. There's a broad consensus in something that looks like the current version of immigration reform. If you look here, who do you have a lot of political commonality with? Black people are choosing Latinos, and Latinos are choosing blacks as their most likely partners. And Asians aren't really perceiving themselves to be with anybody. And whites and Asians are their most likely partners. Certainly followed by, significantly followed by Latinos. Then there's issue commonality on discrimination, You can see that still holds up for black folks. It still holds up. It worked across education, a whole range of things. It holds up as well for Latinos. They still see their coalition partners with blacks as most likely. So, here, I'll just get to the bottom line. So I tried to take symbolic racism scales, social dominance, authoritarian personality, and correlate all that stuff with the stereotypes, and then or use the stereotypes to predict any type of policy alternatives, whether it be affirmative action, whether it be welfare, whether it be immigration reform, and you can't do it with blacks and Latinos the way you do with whites, right? So what that means is that they can hold prejudiced beliefs and ideas, but it doesn't even tell you what they think about affirmative action or what you should do about immigration policy. So that isn't a coherent supremacist ideology, right? That's something that we can work on at the level of a community, because there's no interest involved in it, right? Part of the reason why white supremacy is so coherent is because it helps to structure the opportunities in the world, right? And that's why people will always default to it, because they know where their bread's buttered. So conclusions is the next step. Latino identity is complex, we knew that. Latino stereotyping of blacks is a problem. Latinos might need to work to understand discrimination better. Some of the, I already talked about this in Q&A. Blacks must be educated about immigration issues. Good news. All those things have really low salience for the groups. So it's not stuff that drives the way that they think about themselves and others. And then, so I really got evil. And so I asked a comparison question to one of the Orange County samples. And so the comparison question was the response to the San Diego fires better or worse than the response to Hurricane Katrina? 80% of whites said the San Diego fires were worse. There's like 2 deaths. On stuff like even the Gen 6, that was a question, the issue. Latinos were in accord with blacks in the mirror image of whites. So you can see an increasing way in which Latinos are adopting a racialized view of the world and fairness that makes them much more in accord with blacks than whites. And so that's it. Thank you guys.
Well, the floor up to questions now. Professor Johnson and Professor Sawyer. And Courtney and Jaime have microphones. Okay. Gary?
Oh wait, get chest like that. Thank you. Yep, this question is for Mark. Los Angeles, and it's kind of a similar question that I asked Casey in the last panel. Los Angeles is unique in the sense that, like Miami, like San Antonio, it has very rapidly become a Latin American city in really meaningful ways. And while I have to tell you, I agree 99% of the findings that you present here, and they're constant with my views. I wonder if you think you would find the same thing in major metropolitan areas where African Americans continue to significantly outnumber Latinos, that the demographics of Los Angeles for black-brown relations are just different than they are in other, and say, heavily black cities. Would you get the same result in Philadelphia or St. Louis
or Detroit? Yeah. I don't want to get too far from the data that I have. There's nothing to make me think that would be terribly different, especially because I do have a significant amount of experience with Chicago. And then if you throw New York into the mix, that gets to be really complicated because the black people are sometimes the people who speak Spanish. And they move very fluidly between the groups. So yeah, it might be a little difficult. I mean, but when I've seen the kind of new destinations work, it's not saying what the people who are doing that work are claiming that it's saying. They are pushing it beyond, they're pushing their data beyond what they have. They're making assumptions. And I just want people to take a step back and say, why should we assume that a model for black-white relations and white attitudes is going to predict what Latinos think about black people?
So in that you're referring to Paul's work?
Yeah.
You and I aren't 100%.
Yeah.
Next question?
I had two questions. First for Dr. Johnson. So I appreciated your discussion really about the materiality, downturns, and deindustrialization. I was reminded of your colleague's work, Cedric Robinson's work on racial capitalism. And the idea that, actually existing capitalism is not an economic project. It relies on cultural forms and identities to figure out who lives where, who gets what, on what terms. So I was wondering, I guess the question was about the utility of racial capitalism as a framework for understanding black and brown relations and actually getting us beyond a black and white framework. So how we as scholars interested in comparative race relations might use racial capitalism to pursue new questions. And then the second question was for both of you actually, really going back to this idea of the difficulty of narrating stories of coalition politics. You both presented two kind of accounts. One, individualized solutions, I gotta get mine sort of narratives. The other, as you put it, Dr. Sawyer, the African American Interest School. But I'm reminded of an alternative way of putting that by the late Dr. Manning Marable, who criticized and was actually very skeptical of the people of color paradigm. For him, the notion that for him the paradigm ignored the unevenness of oppression. And so I'm wondering, in both of your works, as you are understanding black and brown relations, what is the particular framework you use to understanding race, people of color, and also trying to make sense of the particular struggles of those various groups? And might there actually be an alternative framework for understanding race?
Is that on? Well, great questions. But first I wondered if you could maybe elucidate a little bit more for everybody what you mean by racial capitalism.
Yeah, well, the idea for Cedric Robinson that, Hello? Yeah. The idea that kind of racialism, the development of racialism is intertwined with the development of capitalism, right? There is no sort of pure capitalism as an economic system in which capital is invested and coordinated by markets, but actually, an actual historical fact, racialism developed alongside capitalism, and the implications, of course, is that most critically, is that there was no slavery without capitalism. There was no capitalism without slavery. So by that's what I mean by racial capitalism, historically speaking, and of course the contemporary implications for understanding the allocation of space and work along racial lines today.
Great. So it is on?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So I see your questions as incredibly intertwined and very good questions. I was listening to a forum in which one of the panelists talked about how the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment was so important for Latinos, but that many of them have no idea about how much blacks paved the way through abolition democracy, and questions of citizenship, and the notion of refusing simply nominal freedom as a kind of gateway for Latino struggle, especially in the 21st century. And I thought that was really astute, but I also thought, I think, in the way your question infers this, that it missed also a spectrum of other things, which is that things that were emancipatory for black people, say in 1965, and as I think Casey's work elucidates, whites were not necessarily liberating for Latinos. or things that have been emancipatory for Chicanos in 1971 might have been devastating for blacks. So, I mean, part of the challenge here is not, as scholars, is to not be uncomfortable with the fact that you're going to run up against these things, and that they don't actually represent any kind of confounding methodological issue, but instead that they get us deeply into the work of what capitalism does, and also get us to be much more, I think, rigorous in our undertaking and engagement with Black Marxism, with these alternate structures of epistemological understanding of not just the histories, but also kind of like, again, the material realities of everyday life for people. And it's rough for ethnographers, because we want to ask these questions and get these answers like, oh yeah, and you feel like, okay, I'm going to find this out. This is what they're going to say. I mean, you know, as somebody.
Inconvenient facts.
Yeah, then you get to inconvenient facts, right? I mean, I remember one time asking Ray Barretto, was so excited to interview this like giant sunset. Oh wait, there is a Chicago connection between us, because my sister-in-law knows about I have to say it because I keep, all of a sudden it just dawned on me. It's an elementary school. Okay, so, but Ray Barretto, I asked him about, I said, you know, I'm so excited to talk to you because your work, he started out playing Cannonball Adderley, and I mean, he was in World War II, he was a jazz guy. But then he becomes really famous for salsa, and especially in the 1970s, and this incredible album, Indestructible, where he was just in many ways used by the young lords to talk about this new blood that is possible with in these incredible lyrics that he talks about, like in your soul when you feel defeated. Look, take heart, because in this new generation is this new promise and possibility. And I asked him about it, and I said, so, you know, tell me about the politics of music. He's like, I'm not about politics. Music knocks all that aside. You know, I'm all about the music. And so again, these inconvenient facts, but also it becomes a methodological issue that I think most of us shy away from. But it is this really critical moment of possibility. And I think that while I think all of us are trained in some ways to walk a little afield of that, it's actually when we get into that and then we start to see these alternative structures emerge. So for me, I think Black Marxism was really influential, and obviously I feel so fortunate to Cedric's office is 2 doors down from mine, and it's wonderful just to, you know, to be able to interact and chop it up with him about these things. But most importantly, I think, is that I think a lot of people mistake, even though it's important for us to locate Black Marxism in the Black radical tradition, they mistake it as something that's not a possible theory for all forms of liberation, right? And so I think we also have to fight against the people internally that are against us in that respect. I did this paper one time about Mexican, what I call a Mexican genesis in Borderlands jazz, where I talked about how so many of like these incredible Sidney Bechet and all these incredible jazz musicians, but blues musicians too, Lead Belly, all these people who actually had Mexican teachers who taught them how to play classical music. And a lot of the Hill brothers who were actually Creole but spent all this time in Mexico, like they taught these guys how to play classical music. But when I gave this paper in Texas, I got all this backlash about how I shouldn't use Borderlands theory because I was recolonizing it for sort of the Black experience. And so we have to be able to then see these are valid critiques because we have a history of the colonizing of our theories that come organically out of our communities. But we have to be, I think, methodologically brave enough to look at these alternative possibilities and to look at racial capitalism, I think, in the way that you were looking at it. So thank you for this question.
Yeah, I guess I see myself primarily as a scholar of comparative race relations. So most of the work I've done has been in Latin America. So the idea that you should either out of hand reject those experiences might be similar, or that you should automatically accept that they're the same is to me deeply problematic. And so, and one of the things that I think is emerging is that Latinos have been encouraged and disciplined to behave as an ethnic group. but they've been treated as a racial group. And that goes all the way back to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which gives them some version of, which grants some version of citizenship, which also grants whiteness. It grants whiteness on paper, not whiteness in practice. So, but then if you go through the history of both Latino organizations and then developments, there become these points of ambivalence about embracing race that Black folks didn't really have an option for. It doesn't delegitimize it, it just is what it is. You also don't, I mean, if we look at the scholarly world, right? What African Americans were able to do at HBCUs in the early part of the 20th century was to kind of codify a series of ideas that are foundational in a very important and powerful way. So, and I think just having those experiences at hand can be really helpful in trying to guide how we understand them. But I've always wondered why people keep thinking of Mexican migrants as new. Right? We were in Mexico. There was nothing new about Mexicans in California. And people keep saying new Mexican migrants. And so, if you take that away, right? I'll put two disciplines on blast. Sociology fetishizes their belief of the 20th century assimilation of white Europeans. It's their paradigm to think about every single migration, and they bracket Black people off. So for sociologists, there's no reason to compare the Great Migration to some of the migrations of Mexico. The fact that people went back and forth, the fact that people already had relatives, the fact that they were already understood in the space as something else, those things are off the table for them. We have to compare Mexican migration. Thou shalt compare Mexican migration to the 20th century. The other blast that I have for political science. So like Cedric Robinson, he isn't read by young Black political scientists. And the reason is because in the 1950s, the late 40s and 50s, the NSF decided that thou shalt do behavioralism, because behavioralism was depoliticized for research. Not that I do some of it myself, but the whole problem was that a politicized electorate always either ends in Bolshevism or fascism. So we have to figure out, the job of political scientists was to figure out how elites can control mass political mobilization. So you can't have Cedric Robinson writing about Black Marxism. He's got to stay in Black studies at UC Santa Barbara.
Yeah, and sociologists don't read Du Bois.
Even though he invented it.
I think the greatness is, I think, comparable.
Last question.
Are you proposing a shift from the analytical shift, a route from a middle class approach after World War II? Because I am still struggling by the idea of why people like Hugo Chavez so much, and why there's affirmation of prejudice without racism. And I was thinking, how in Latin America, after the end of World War II, the USA strategy to transform indigenous people and Afro descendants in mestizo consumers. Like being middle class was at hand for everybody. That fantasy of that material possibility. But what I'm seeing here is in a context where there is less or no social mobility after Reaganomics, after everything that is going on. Are you proposing this new coalition of this new way of doing politics? A shift from that perspective of everybody. We can be middle class, but this country is a classless society. All these fantasies that are very powerful, but probably brown and black people is an issue of prejudice. But what about the fantasy of being a middle class, right, that we are born in Central America and Mexico? And it's a very powerful mobilizer. So I'm thinking in radical politics is that you are proposing a shift because in academia, it's just taken for granted. This is a middle, everybody can be a middle class. This is a meritocracy. Are you proposing that sort of theoretical, political, methodological innovation? Because for me, it's a surprise that Black Marxism, because in many countries in Latin America, there is no any mystery about talking about socialism of the 21st century. But here is still very highly unpopular. Talking about it's considered it's out of fashion. But why Black people like each other so much?
Yeah, your question hits at the core. But I'm always careful when particularly interacting with working class people or very materially deprived people, both in the US and Latin America, that while we can understand the contradictions and the problems of bourgeois consumer culture, it provides a certain amount of day-to-day comfort. And from a perch on academia, to not be cognizant of that. And what consumer culture, while right now it needs to be fixed in some radical way, and maybe it is, but the idea that poor people have the kind of, I think you miss them if you don't understand their aspirations for some kind of bourgeois material comfort. And you articulate yourself too stridently about that. And I've seen radicals go into communities and do things like that. Like even the worst one was my wife was working for SEIU, and she was recruiting and hiring organizers. And the white woman she was working for kept getting mad at her because she said that the Black folks dressed too fancy in the interviews. And to try and explain this to the woman that this was a sign of respect and respect the thing, and he didn't say anything about your necessarily class position, and like, you could never get her to understand that. She's too strident about what she thinks is good for them to really understand. If you really live in a Black working class community, you understand that people dress up to go to people's houses. So, I don't know.
I think that, yes, I think this is true. I think that we have to understand why the aspiration, this is an ingrained social thing. This is something that's been perfected, that's been in cultural production and media. The desire has been cultivated through now decades of consumer politics and the deployment of some kinds of market practices. In terms of strategy, though, I believe that some of the organizers and academics that I respect the most are as you said, incredibly sensitive to the fact that there's a desire for these consumer comforts and middle classness that functions as an escape, but also as a legitimate desire. People should say, I want more and I deserve more. But unfortunately, this is the only language, I think, that a lot of people have to express that entitlement, is to say, I want these things, and I should be able to wear these things. And we know that narrative. I feel like our task as people who love freedom and who are dreaming about something different is to uncover why that is, and to provide spaces where people can come to understand and interrogate their own realities, to understand how market forces operate in their communities and how this has influenced this desire for ascension in the middle classes. And I think you're right that people talking about socialism is very different here than it is in Latin America. And I think that my experiences in South America have been that when people talk about politics in a much more fluid way than here. But I also find that the ingrained racism in South America and the whole indelibility of whiteness is so difficult in many ways to move and to make malleable in ways that's different from here. It's very hard So that's just as an aside. But I do believe, yes, I mean, answer to your question really concisely is yes, I do propose a shift. I do think that regardless of all of the ways in which that has functioned as a survival strategy and even as a legitimate source of entitlement and articulation about what we deserve, I still think it's false. And I think that the people who organize, as I said, the people who I think have offered some of the most eloquent understandings of the market and of social justice, I think they understand this, but they don't have mercy on it. I think they say, this is something that we can't afford to keep doing. And if we keep doing this, then we'll never be what we, we think that we want to be in that middle class, but really what we want is equity, we want social justice, and we need to retrain ourselves to want those things as much as we've been taught to buy these other things. So I mean, it's rather, I think, a simply stated answer to what I think is a very eloquent question. But yes, I think that what that is wrong. And I think that the best of us in the classroom, in the community, and everywhere, we do it in ways that are sensitive, as you were just saying. I mean, we have to be sensitive to who we're talking to. But wrong is wrong, no matter how you put it.
But I guess we've all come to the conclusion that social democracy is dead, right? That absent the Soviet option, there's no social. I mean, it's sad, but probably so.
I mean, I do think that we do these things because we have faith that things can change. And I do think justice is possible. I do think that what's going on now isn't fair, and that's also not something that it's kind of like what my colleague George says is, we don't want to be those people who practice inaction masquerading as cynicism. We want to be the people who say, look, I'm ready to look at these things and I'm ready to talk about them no matter how hard they are, and not willing to give up on the possibility that we can have a fair and equal representation and treatment of people's dignity and humanity.
Thank you. Thank you for those eloquent questions and those compelling answers. I just have a few thank yous and a few shout outs. I'd like to thank the Center for Latin American Studies, of course, the African American and African American Studies program, the Chicano Latino Studies program, and the Center for Humanities. I'd like to thank Professor Segura, Professor Alim, of course, Dr. Johnson, Dr. Sawyer, Sylvia, Casey, and everyone who joined us here today. Thank you so much. And Professor Johnson and Professor Sawyer will be book signing out in the lobby if you guys are interested, and you can continue this conversation out there.